Okay, this is John Burroughs again, and I'm going to continue with my autobiography, 7 Years to Life. This is chapter 40, and it's called All Hands Off Deck. Though we were still not on speaking terms, my father convinced a buddy of his to give me a job. I am sure that my mother was a major influence in getting me my first job. It was during the summer of 1967, between my first and second senior year. It was a machine shop that specialized in ship repair. Unbeknownst to my parents and my employer, I often came to work on marijuana or coming down from an acid trip. I was basically a helper and pretty much fetched needed tools, drove to pick up materials, or assisted in any way that I could. Many times the job required that certain types of repairs were performed on site on the particular ship that was in port for minor repairs, safety checks, and additional cargo destined for the ship's next destination. Rarely was our small business involved in major repairs that needed to take place in dry dock, where the ship was entirely out of the water. My favorite part of the ship was when I went with a repair crew to a ship. Exploring the ship and its sheer size and amazing construction appealed to me in such a way that I decided to apply for my ordinary seaman, messman, and wiper's card. Without this card, you were not allowed to actually go to sea. This was the entry-level titles for rookies beginning their merchant marine career. The titles on the card had general duties associated with it. Ordinary seaman simply meant that you did what was asked of you by anyone with a higher rank. A messman helped out in the galley or kitchen by doing cleanup and assisting cooks in the preparation of meals. A wiper would walk around the ship and wipe down anything that could rust easily or cause a person to slip. I was often drawn to the galley because when we were working on board, the ship's cooks would often prepare free lunches for us. The galley was stocked with the finest meats and vegetables anywhere, and depending on the particular cook, you might get anything from a full-blown delicious steak lunch, complete with a salad, baked potato with all the fixing, hot vegetables, and to finish it off with a slice of pie or cheesecake, and it was accompanied by the beverage of your choice. On other days, you might receive a tuna sandwich, a couple of cookies, and a glass of milk. Nobody ever complained. After all, it was free. There were 4 things I will never forget when we were doing onboard ship repairs. Excuse me. The first one is quite common in almost any work environment. Every person on the crew drank coffee. However, it was the unbelievable amounts of coffee these guys drank. We often stopped at Red's Java House, a famous small little San Francisco run-down cafe, before we ever arrived at the ship, and had 3 or 4 cups of coffee there. When we did arrive on the ship before beginning our work, everyone headed down to the galley for a couple more cups. By the time we finished drinking the cups in the galley and the conversations that took place while we drank them, we were left with only about 2 hours or so until lunch. You would think that everybody brought their own lunch because they all carried lunch pails of some sort. There was ample time for lunch, and what I soon found out was most guys went to the galley and had the free lunch that was usually washed down with soda or juice. They would then go topside, sit on the deck, open their lunch pails, remove the thermos filled with coffee that each pail contained, smoke cigarettes, and tell tall tales about their harrowing adventures while at sea. After all this, there was still enough time for a couple of guys to grab everyone's large thermoses, hop into one of the company's trucks, and take the short ride back to Red's Java House, and for a nominal cost, all the thermoses were refilled with coffee to get them through the afternoon. If I had not witnessed this ritual with my own eyes, I would not believe it was humanly possible to consume that much coffee in 8 to 10 hours. Excuse me. There was a welder that worked for the company that had more or less taken me under his wing. He was called Junior, and whenever he and I had a free moment, he would show me the job he was doing and why the welding was not only extremely important, but you could always find a job welding and it paid a decent wage. I think he enjoyed showing me, hoping to spur my interest in welding. I was not interested in it because it seemed to be so repetitious and boring. However, I really enjoyed talking with Junior and the stories he would tell me about his youth. Junior was the first black man I had ever met from the Deep South, and he had that laid-back coolness and sense of humor that was commonplace in the Deep South. I do not know where Steve Harvey is from, but that is who reminds me of Junior. One day, while on the deck of a ship, I heard a loud argument coming from the dock below. It was Junior arguing with another guy I had seen before named Rusty, and he was an employee of the company that managed the pier. Rusty was a real piece of work. He was one of those rednecks that drove a Charger, I believe it was, with a large Confederate flag painted on the roof. Rodney B. sidled up against me and said there was going to be a fight. He asked me if I had ever seen Junior fight before. Rodney said that he would never mess with Junior. The yelling became louder, and I looked back down and saw Junior and Rusty screaming at each other by one of the welding generators. There were containers on the sides of these generators where workers would deposit any excess metal shavings to be transported back to the shop to be thrown or reused. The tempers finally got the best of them, and the fight was on. As I look back to that day and the fight, I understand what Rodney meant when he said he would not mess with Junior. It was comparable to Muhammad Ali taking on Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. The fight, as expected, ended quickly, but with a completely unexpected result. Junior, who possessed lightning speed in addition to formidable power, had jabbed Rusty twice, snapping his head back, opening up his midsection for a well-timed uppercut to the belly, and followed with a right hook that sent Rusty sprawling on the ground, where he ended up leaning on the welding machine in a shocked state. As Junior approached Rusty, he was greeted with a handful of metal shavings thrown by Rusty directly into Junior's eyes. Junior was not only blinded, he was screaming from the pain, and he was essentially helpless. A cowardly act committed by a cowardly man, and might have been tolerable if it ended there. However, Rusty, being the coward he was, began to kick Junior mercilessly. Rodney and I, along with some other guys, realized that Rusty was not going to stop any time soon, and ran down the dock and pulled Rusty away. Rodney got into the driver's seat of the company's truck, and I gently slid Junior toward the center next to Rodney. I got in next to Junior, and we drove him to the emergency room. From the emergency room, we called our boss, who called Junior's wife and told her what had happened. Rodney and I were still in the waiting room when Junior's wife and daughter came running in, looking for a status on her husband's condition. We introduced ourselves to her, and she looked at me quietly said, "Junior speaks about you often. He told me that you keep him entertained because you are usually high on pot, and you never hesitated to voice your opinion about anything or anybody. He also said you were perhaps the funniest person he had ever heard aside from Red Fox, because you had some of the best insults he had ever heard, and you would insult anyone, including yourself, and anyone regardless of race, religion, or sex. He considers you a dear friend, and I am glad you decided to stick around." Junior came out about 1.5 hours later with bandages and patches on both eyes, escorted by the doctor. His wife gently hugged him while his daughter, with tears running down her cheeks, asked her daddy if he was okay. Junior reassured her he was. The doctor explained to us that the majority of the time he spent was using surgical tweezers to carefully pick the shavings from Junior's eyes. He said he was going to be fine, but the bandages would have to stay on for about a week, and he would be in some extreme pain for the next month. As he was being wheeled out of the emergency room, he looked over his shoulders and said, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you guys." Rodney answered back, "I'm sure you'll find a way." And more ominous words have never been spoken, because it was just 6 weeks later, towards summer's end, that the opportunity presented itself when Junior was able to repay us twofold. There were times when the ship that was in port had to leave in a much shorter time frame in order for the captain to stay as close as possible to the schedule that was promised to its customers. This did not allow us the time frame that we normally had to service a ship. When this was the situation, some of the men had to work 24-hour shifts that were approved by the union, with stipulations that increased the number and time of breaks during that type of shift. It was also required that anyone who worked a 24-hour shift had the following 2 days off after said shift was completed. The only reason that this is included in the story is to demonstrate how unions were sorely needed at points in history. The unions, I believe, as time went by, became more of a detriment than an asset. During this period of my life, the unions were still a very valuable resource and stood up for workers' rights. There was corruption in the hierarchy, but that was true of any company, union, or otherwise, where the allure of power caused more than a few to forsake their principles. The one time I was on a 24-hour shift, I spent 14 hours watching on deck as a welder did some repairs that required his expertise. The deck was metal, and the welder was repairing some cracks and minor splits that were almost invisible to the naked eye. I was watching someone weld on a metal deck where nothing within 50 yards of us was even remotely flammable. There was not the slightest chance that the small sparks would ignite anything, much less cause a fire. Yet there I was, bored to death and starting to experience double vision. Finally, it was time for a break. The welder sat down, and I sat down next to him. I asked him, "No offense to you, but I've been sitting here twiddling my thumbs for the last 3 hours, making sure nothing catches fire, and in all honesty, I would bet my paycheck that it's not going to happen." He took a drag of his cigarette and chuckled right before he said to me, "I've been doing this for 18 years, and so far no fire has broke out. However, it is a union requirement that someone fire watches. I would not want your job, but if you ever have to do it again, I suggest you bring a flask of something that will warm your insides, roll up your jacket and use it as a pillow, and catch a little shut-eye. A 24-hour shift can make you a little stir-crazy, regardless of what you are doing. At least you don't have to scrape the boilers. I had the pleasure of performing that job a couple of times before and after each time I almost quit." In essence, the fire watch duty was useless, but it was a notch in the union's cap when it came to job creation and generating additional dues. Excuse me. I began to wonder how many other useless jobs had been created, because sometimes I would take my breaks down in the galley during a 24-hour shift, and you would always find 2 or 3 guys with their heads down on the table, sleeping while receiving overtime pay. It was on a fairly cold summer day, which is not unusual for San Francisco in the summertime, when the incident occurred that changed how I felt about ship repair from that day forward. It was one of those cold days that did not make your nose run or your teeth chatter, but the chill accompanied by the wind did make your hands shake. One of the major duties that had to be performed with the utmost quality when a ship was in for servicing was to safety inspect the lifeboats for any structural damage and make sure the proper amount of rations were on board and were still edible and had not expired or possibly split open. A freighter is very similar to a cruise ship as far as the lifeboats are concerned. The lifeboats were usually situated on the second or third deck, depending on the size of the ship. They were attached to two mechanical arms, one on each side of the boat, that if it became necessary, would extend out beyond the ship's railing. Once the boat was extended to the desired position, each arm had cables that would mechanically lower the lifeboat down toward the ocean. When the lifeboat was approximately 2 feet above the water, someone would pull out the cotter key that held the reverse lever in place, and the boat would drop the remaining 2 feet into the water. On this particular chilly day, there were 4 of us in the lifeboat, each inspecting something different. The lifeboat was on the second deck, roughly 100 to 120 feet above the water. We were insulting each other while performing our inspection, and the laughter seemed to warm the air. I was never able to say for sure, but I think the kidding around and insulting each other caused us to take this part of the job more lightly than we should have. Unbelievably, not one of the 4 of us noticed the cotter key missing from the spring-loaded release lever. One of us inadvertently kicked the release lever, unhooking the boat from its clamps, and we began a rapid descent toward the water from 120 feet in the air. There were 2 sounds that were unmistakable that day. The first was the loud snap that the release lever made, and the second was the tail end of the lifeboat hitting the ship's railing. We began a rapid descent towards the water, each headed downward with our own thoughts in our heads. I can remember vividly that as we fell, we all looked at each other with a hopeless glance that more or less said, "It was nice knowing you." It was mere seconds later when we slammed into the water at a slight angle. It was the slight angle that became our salvation. As I looked around the boat, relief overwhelmed me, and I started crying like a baby when I realized we were all alive, and I could hear and see Junior swimming in the water and yelling that everyone should remain still because the medics were on the way. Junior was the only one who cared enough to dive into the water and swim to the boat to see how he could help. Looped over his shoulder was a first aid kit in case anyone had sustained serious lacerations. One guy had some cracked ribs, but we all survived. It was explained to me later that if the tail end of the boat had not hit the ship's railing, that we would have fell 120 feet and the boat would have hit the water like a massive belly flop, the sheer impact killing us all. It was because of the angle that we entered the water that was somewhat like a rocking chair, considerably decreased the force at which we entered the water, lessening the degree of impact by a great deal. I began to feel like I actually had 9 lives, but that was not enough to overcome my desire to move on. 3 days later, I had lunch with Junior and thanked him for the kindness and friendship he bestowed on me. We went back to the shop and I walked into my boss's office and quit. You tell me, was it just plain luck or another example of divine intervention leading me to where I am today?